Let's get started then. Good morning and welcome everybody to the second day of our conference, the IEO 20, celebrating the second decade of the IEO and an opportunity to consider the challenges that lie ahead. We had a very rich set of discussions yesterday. If you missed yesterday and would like to see a recording or even to replay what you saw, we will be posting it on our website very shortly. Today we have two more sessions that both should be really interesting. I'm particularly looking forward to our first session, hearing remarks from Ngaire Woods, who is a well-known thinker and advocate for strong international economic governance, and also a longtime friend and supporter of the IEO. And then we'll have a final session starting around 11:45, where we bring together a panel of people who've worked with the IEO, know us well from many different perspectives, and that will provide the wrap-up for our conference, giving us advice on how we should move forward. I should mention before we get going that this session is being recorded and will be posted on our website as soon as we can after the meeting is over. So with that introduction, let me pass over to Prakash Loungani, Assistant Director in IEO, who's going to moderate this first session. Prakash.
Thanks very much, Charles. We are honored this morning to have Ngaire Woods as the keynote speaker at our conference. She's the Dean of the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. She also sits on the advisory board of the Center for Global Development and is a member of the advisory panel of the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. She was a member of the first external evaluation panel of the IEO itself in 2006. She's the author of one of my favorite books. It's called The Globalizers, the IMF, World Bank, and their borrowers. And my copy of it is starting to get dog-eared because I've gone through it a few times and find something to mark down each time. Ngaire will be followed by Tom Bernes. He's a distinguished fellow at CIGI, the Center for International Governance Innovation. He was the director of the IEO from 2005 to 2009 and has held other senior positions at the World Bank, the OECD, and the IMF itself, where he was executive director from 1996 to 2001. Next up is Bessma Momani, Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. She's also a senior fellow at CIGI and a non-resident fellow at Brookings. She has long been a thoughtful commentator on the IMF and has been quite involved in our work here at the IEO in various capacities. She's the author of another of my favorite books. I only have it on the Kindle, so I don't know if you can see it, but it's called What's Wrong with the IMF and How to Fix It. It's a great read that covers many aspects, if all aspects of the IMF's operations. Our last speaker will be Siddharth Tiwari. He's Chief Representative for Asia and the Pacific at the BIS, the Bank of International Settlements. He led the work of the G20 Eminent Persons Group on global financial governance, issuing a very useful report that we've used here at the IEO for a number of our evaluations. He held many of the most senior positions at the fund, including director of the Strategy, Policy, and Review Department for 6 years. And before that, secretary of the IMF and the IMFC, and head of the budget office, and also head of the office of the managing director. So welcome to all of you. And Ngaire, the floor is yours. You have 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have remarks from Bessma, Tom, and Siddharth for 5 to 7 minutes each as an initial reaction, and then if there is time, we will do a second go around. And for folks who are participating, please do feel free to put questions in the chat at any time. It's over to you, Ngaire.
Thank you, Prakash, and thank you, Charles, for inviting me to speak, and thanks everybody for being part of this conversation. Over the last couple of days during this excellent meeting that the IEO have put together, there's been a lot of debate about evaluation. And a lot of that debate is around the perennial questions of evaluation. What to evaluate and who decides that? An issue that has had its moments of contentiousness between the IMF and the IEO. The second is who should conduct the evaluation? Is it indeed an independent office, or is it externals, or do internals do a better job? Again, much debated over these last 2 days. And the final issue about how will the evaluation be used and what impact will it have? Should the IEO be aiming mainly to help the IMF to learn from its own successes and challenges, or should it be there to ensure that its board holds the staff and management to account? And it's those last questions that I'm going to focus on as I step back in this keynote to think about the role of the IEO in ensuring the IMF's success in a moment in which the world desperately needs a facilitator of international cooperation. So let me start by recalling what it is, why it is that governments around the world created the IMF in the first place. What do we need this international organization to do? 3 very simple prerequisites for effective international cooperation. The first, a set of commonly agreed rules, principles, or conventions. So an organization that brings countries together to agree on those rules. The second, a monitoring of how countries are complying with those rules. And the third, an institution that can collect and share information and knowledge, which points to where it is that countries can cooperate in their mutual interest. These 3 things no country can do on its own, and these 3 things, therefore, countries have created the IMF to do for them. But to deliver on those 3 prerequisites, the IMF, like all other international institutions that are going to be effective, needs to have a governance and a credibility such that governments, each of its member governments, are willing to share information with it, to participate in its standard setting or rulemaking, and to subject themselves to the organization's monitoring. That's tricky, and that's what we're going to think about today, and the context in which today we're asking the IMF to do this. All of us in this seminar know that the governance of the IMF was created very delicately to balance the extraordinary power of the United States after the Second World War, and at the same time, its desire not to be caught up in entangling relations with the rest of the world. The result, the compromise, was an institution which still today has the United States enjoying special rights which were placed there to ensure its participation at the heart of the organization, hosting the organization next to its seat of government, a voting power which gives it a single veto on decisions of critical importance, and a very powerful voice, to some degree behind the scenes, over who leads the organization, not just a voice in who the managing director is and who the first deputy managing director is, but across the leadership as a whole. That pact, come to in the 1940s, was subsequently cemented by the Cold War. So once the Cold War came into being, the United States security priorities came to overlay and reinforce its special position in the IMF, a position which we saw very clearly in the organization's lending patterns through until 1990. Now, I mention all that because perhaps the most challenging feature for the IMF, and the one in which the IEO, in my view, plays the most important role today, is the geostrategic rivalry, which sits at the heart of the world economy in which the IMF is trying to facilitate cooperation. The United States and China are competing for markets and resources. They're competing for dominance over technology, but they're also competing for influence over the rules and the institutions which govern international relations. And that leaves the IMF constantly torn between the great powers, or I should say it risks leaving the IMF constantly torn between these two great powers, or being seen and perceived as a pawn of one or the other. It risks leaving the rest of the world without an IMF which can facilitate cooperation to support global macroeconomic and financial stability. Like the IMF itself, many countries around the world today risk being torn between the two emerging great powers. And yet, from the strategic rivals themselves to the smallest economies in the world, all share a powerful and existential need for cooperation if they're going to enjoy a modicum of global economic stability. And it's in this world, a world of that strategic rivalry, that the IMF's credentials as a multilateral institution serving all countries, not just one or other of the powerful, are absolutely crucial. There is what I'll describe as a thin blue line which separates the IMF from its creator and hegemon, the United States, and from undue influence of other countries. And that thin blue line is the governance of the IMF and the even-handedness of the way in which it collects information and monitors compliance and sets standards. And right at the core of that governance is an executive board to which the Independent Evaluation Office reports. We all know that countries are represented on the board and that the board is often referred to as an instrument of accountability. We also know that the executive directors on the board are enjoined, just as the staff and management are, to further the mandate of the organization and not the special interests of their countries of origin. But of course, the reality is that members on the board have vastly unequal influence, well beyond their differences in voting power. And even beyond that, there's an unseen presence, a simple, unspoken, perhaps even unconscious assumption by many of the staff of the IMF as they go about their work, that whatever they do will need to attract the approval of their most powerful members. At other times, of course, the influence of those powerful members is overt, as some of the IEO's own reports, often very diplomatically, point out. And in that context, the role of the IEO, the role of an independent evaluation office, is a vital and, in my view, ever more important attribute of the IMF. Put simply, it can reinforce the thin blue line. The IEO working effectively can reinforce the multilateral character of the IMF in a way that all of its membership, and beyond that, the public, can see. And that reinforcement is going to be a sine qua non. It's going to be an absolutely essential characteristic if the institution is going to continue in the next decade to persuade governments willingly to share information, to participate in its standard setting or rulemaking, and to subject themselves to its monitoring, whether they are more friendly with China or whether they are more friendly with the United States. The IEO, acting as an instrument of all board members through its independent evaluations, can monitor that governance, monitor the even-handedness. It can give assurance to members, big and small, not, and here I think it's important to stress, it's an assurance not that the IMF will act without flaw or fault, or even without undue influence, but that when it does, the executive board will be informed and will be equipped to hold the institution to account and to require it to correct its actions. So that's the challenge for the IEO. The challenge is how it helps the IMF to retain credibility and trust from member states in a world of a strategic rivalry. I'd like to move now to three of the most important challenges that the IMF needs to facilitate cooperation on, and to think about what that means for what we need the IEO to do. Let me start with a first area, some would say a first of the global public goods that the IEO needs to assure. And that lies in the fiscal and monetary effects of the COVID pandemic. What we know is that what any one country does, both in its fiscal policy and its monetary policy, will affect all of those around, all the countries around them. And yet, very few countries have the resources, the information, or even the incentive to examine the effects of their own policies on their neighbours, let alone to aggregate the effects of all policies of all countries in their region or in the world. And that is one of the core tasks of the IMF. Now, today that task looks huge. COVID-19, as the IMF itself has highlighted, by November 2020 had led to $11.7 trillion in global fiscal support. It had led to $7.5 trillion in liquidity support by the monetary authorities in major advanced countries. And it's what happens next that the IMF is going to have to work quickly with huge agility and adeptness on. And some of the issues it will face are familiar, and some will be new and challenging. The IEO can help it with both. On the familiar issues, the IEO has a lot to share with the fund. Its evaluations on fiscal adjustment, on the IMF's role in financial crises, and and as well as on monetary policy, where the IEO's evaluations on unconventional monetary policies in 2019 and other evaluations help. Equally, however, the IEO needs to stand back and ask not just what can the IMF learn from its previous practice, but is it pushing hard enough to look at whether a new approach is warranted? Is it daring to look at less conventional policies, both in the fiscal space and in the monetary space? Does it have a clearly elaborated strategy to deal with the new parts of the post-COVID fiscal and monetary policy? And is it ensuring that it's developing real expertise at great speed to deploy in order to help countries have the information they need about their neighbours and the aggregate effects? That's going to be crucial moving forwards. And I'm going to come back to how we might adjudicate the role of the IEO on this in a moment. Let me first just outline the other two big issues. The second big issue is the way in which COVID-19 has deepened the divide between the haves and the have-nots. Everywhere, COVID-19 has had a disproportionate effect on the young, the low-skilled, on women, and the IMF has done a good job in capturing some of that. They cite that these effects will translate into close to 90 million people falling below the extreme poverty threshold since the pandemic started. That's 90 million people thrust below the extreme poverty threshold. Deepening these fault lines is the fact that many countries still don't have adequate access to vaccines. And repairing these fault lines will require cooperation. It will require cooperation to help countries to fight the virus and to sustain a cooperative approach to keep it under control. And here the IMF have a policy proposal jointly endorsed by the WHO and the World Bank and the World Trade Organization. The question the IEO rightly pushes in one of its own evaluations is whether the fund, beyond getting these organizations to jointly approve this statement, is well enough equipped now to actually collaborate in implementation with these and other international organizations. And that's an issue I think we need to come back to. But the other thing I want to say about a world of haves and have-nots is that this is simply not a national issue, even aside from the global containment of the contagion of COVID-19. There are different kinds of contagion effects from the extreme inequality we're seeing emerge around the world. There's the aftermath of rising extremist policies, of increasing immigration as countries fall into fragility and into conflict. The fund has experience of those issues, but now we really need to take a much bigger approach to thinking about what it is, not just that the IMF needs to do, but the IMF needs to do in close collaboration with other international organizations to repair those fault lines and to ensure that those spillovers do not actually occur. The third issue I want to highlight is climate change. There are, I believe they're called IMF old-timers, that think that climate change is not part of the IMF's remit, but that simply cannot be now that we can see the scientific evidence about the threat that climate change poses to global stability, including monetary and financial stability. The IMF's own research suggests that the loss of global economic output will exceed 20% by 2100 if no further action is taken. Climate change can only be abated by cooperative measures, and so too the necessary adaptation measures between now and then need cooperation. And again, the spillovers go well beyond the economic, but have very quick backlashes onto the economies of all countries of the world. So I've set the stage for you of a world riven by a new strategic rivalry, but one in which those strategic rivals still desperately need cooperation. And three issues on which urgent cooperation is particularly necessary. And I'd like to end by suggesting 4 questions that we can bring to the IEO to ask about how it is that the IEO can help the IMF be a credible and effective organization amidst this strategic rivalry and facing these 3 challenges. And the first is the obvious question that's already been asked throughout this seminar about whether the IEO is fostering learning by staff and management on these specific issues. And is it bringing sufficient of the IMF's own research, as well as research from other countries, other organizations, to bear on these problems, and ensuring that the IMF is managing to be less inward-looking and more outward-looking in learning how it can be more effective. The second, and to me this has been inadequately treated to date by thinkers around the world thinking about the IMF and the IEO, which is the role in strengthening the board oversight, both of the adequacy of IMF risk analysis. For example, the risks that occur if the IMF fails to collaborate deeply with regional and international organizations, as the IEO has highlighted it's struggling to do. And on this oversight function, it's really worth remembering that there is a hierarchy between the managing director and the senior management and the board. The board does not like that confrontation with the managing director. And for that reason, it's one of the reasons why the IEO was needed in the first place. That the board, the executive directors of the board, not only sit in a slightly junior position to the managing director and senior management, but they sit ill-equipped with information, expertise and experience of the organization. Typically, they rotate every couple of years. They need an independent source of information so that they can turn and assure countries across the world that the IMF really is doing its multilateral mandate in a multilateral way. The IEO's commentary on even-handedness and what the IMF can do to reinforce its even-handedness on this issue is important. The third, perhaps even more important issue is the role the IEO could play, as I said at the beginning of today's lecture, in facilitating effective governance. And that means facilitating and ensuring that every member country of the IMF feels that its needs, interests, challenges, and effects on it are being taken into account in board decisions. That means the IEO equipping the board to press for more management and staff attention to neglected concerns, to neglected countries. That the IEO's role is to ensure the multilateral character of the fund. And it's done this in some of its evaluations to date. And all I'm doing today is underlining that in a world of the strategic rivalry, that role in equipping the board continually to assure that this is a multilateral institution is crucial. And fourth and finally, the question would be, is the IEO bolstering the external credibility of the fund? Is it informing and engaging groups outside the fund and helping channel back to the IMF views from outside it? Equally, it's important for the IEO simply and clearly to communicate its messages to the outside world, because very often by publicizing and giving evidence of some of the tensions and challenges within the fund, outsiders can then help catalyze change within the fund itself. So the IEO has the direct conduit going to the board, but it also has the indirect conduit of helping the public and member governments understand the challenges of the fund and bring their own pressure to bear on it. I want to end with an issue, a very tricky issue that the IEO has perhaps wisely stayed clear of, but I want to suggest a way on which it could engage in this. I think we've seen in recent months that the leadership of international organizations is a really important part of their credibility to members. We've seen this play out in the strategic rivalry, with the US and China now very strongly competing to ensure that their preferred candidates win the headships of different UN specialized agencies and international organizations. But the headships of these organizations should not simply be seen as the prizes of one or other of the most powerful states. The headships of these organizations are a vital part of what can make them much more multilateral in a world which risks being split into a balance of power. And there are three ways that a powerful leader can do that. And the first is where leaders in different international organizations successfully forge coalitions across some of the members to support the mandate, even to countervail some of the powerful states. And quietly behind the scenes, a dedicated multilateral leader of these organizations can bring together those coalitions and facilitate them to have their voice heard. A second area in which we can see variations across the effectiveness of leaders is how well they persuade members adequately to finance the organization's core function, rather than simply add different specific interested functions to the organization. And the third is the management role of the senior management, simply by managing their organization's staff, attracting the best staff, retaining them, promoting them, and ensuring that the organization is both equipped and is deploying its resources towards the greatest challenges that its full membership face. Put simply, the leadership of each international organization will matter more and more to assuring its multilateral character. And that doesn't mean just the meritocratic selection of a leader or choosing leaders that have demonstrated already that they can do these three things. It also goes to how we, in an ongoing way, evaluate leadership performance and how we evaluate leadership performance when it comes to reappointment. And this is an important area because at the moment, the issue mostly, and in most international organizations, falls simply to the most powerful states who appoint those leaders in the first place. So how might the Independent Evaluation Office do this? I'm certainly not suggesting that the Independent Evaluation Office should evaluate the leadership. But where I think the IEO could play a role, given that this is an issue which all international organizations struggle with, is to work with the IEOs of other international organizations jointly to compare the frameworks and processes used to evaluate leadership performance in different organizations. I know when the AIIB was founded, the example of the IMF's current leadership performance mechanism, which I think internally people would say is fairly bureaucratized, was nevertheless one of the few that existed, and therefore some heed was paid to it. I think perhaps this is an issue, though, that it's worth sharing experience across international organizations and for IEOs to look at, and to look at the experience of private sector and other public sector organizations, so as to offer the boards of each organization, including the board of the IMF, in ever improving ways to evaluate leadership performance. So let me conclude by saying this is a period of unprecedented challenge for countries around the world, dealing with the aftermath of COVID-19, the fiscal and monetary problems that have emerged, the huge and accelerating divide between haves and have-nots, and the climate change effects that are already happening, as well as the measures needed to contain climate change further on. In that world, the world desperately needs to facilitate cooperation. It needs a formal institution to do that, precisely because there is an ever-increasing deficit of trust, both within countries and across countries. And in that context, an IMF that finds pathways to strengthen its multilateral character and the reason that the public and its member states can trust it is vital. And the contribution of the Independent Evaluation Office to that, by helping the fund learn to be more effective, by empowering the board with the information that helps it keep holding the institution to account, and by bolstering the external credibility of the fund is vital. Thank you all. I'll stop there.
Thanks very much, Ngaire. That was interesting and inspiring, just the kind of dress we needed for our 20th birthday party, and as we think ahead to our next decade. Let me now turn to the discussants. We'll start with Tom Bernes. Tom.
Thank you very much, Prakash and Charles. It's a pleasure to be back, even virtually, with some of my former colleagues. My personal history with IEO goes back to its very creation. I chaired the evaluation committee of the executive board in the late 90s that developed the model of IEO and negotiated its approval for its creation with the managing directors at the time. As Prakash said, I also had the honor to serve as its second director from 2005 to 2009. Attending a conference like this is a little like watching your 20-year-old child doing many things you hope for and are proud of, other things you're not quite sure about, and finally, wondering where the future will take it. It's a particular pleasure to follow Ngaire, whose involvement with evaluation at the IMF has paralleled mine in many ways. She has had a significant impact on IEO's activities, and we would do well to reflect very carefully on her observations and suggestions. Many speakers yesterday noted the three functions of IEO: to support learning, board oversight, and enhancing external credibility. When we created IEO 20 years ago, of course, it was a different time. The IMF was widely seen as secretive and lacking in transparency, not just by the outside world, but by many board members at the time who felt that staff might review things, but the dynamics, the alternatives were not shared beyond staff. Therefore, the emphasis by the board back then was on transparency and oversight. Those were the two functions the board thought were most important. Of course, times have changed. The fund has made monumental progress in opening itself up, and IEO has, I believe, played a major role in that progress. Achieving greater transparency for external partners has probably been the original objective most fulfilled by IEO. Assisting the board in its oversight function has also seen progress. But IEO is not and cannot replace the board. MIPS, follow-up reports, etc. help, but successful oversight by the board will only happen with a strong and qualified board. As the evaluation IEO did on IMF governance showed, challenges remain with respect to board governance. Perhaps here, there's also a role for IEO to play, not only in finding ways to help in the assessment of management leadership, as Ngaire has suggested, but also including the role of board. And again, this is a common problem faced by many organizations. That takes us to enhancing the learning culture of the fund. As Charles said yesterday, there is a tension between the oversight function and the learning function. 20 years ago, well, that sounds like a long time, there was no question in our minds that oversight and transparency were more important objectives than learning, even though in the mandate we placed learning first to try and comfort staff and management who were resisting this initiative. And as we heard yesterday from Sean and others, staff have come to appreciate, if not love, IEO, but it has been a struggle and resistance still exists. As Moises reminded us yesterday about Hector Torres' comment, unsolicited advice is never welcomed. As management and staff forcefully and correctly reminded us some 20 years ago, there is a history of a very strong review function in the fund. IEO is unlikely to have a eureka moment and discover something that had not been thought of before. There truly is very little new under the sun. It needs, the bigger question in my mind is why an approach was adopted over the alternatives. Understanding the who and the why then allows you to begin to form a constituency for change. Just developing an alternative view is rarely sufficient. There's been no shortage of ideas and topics for future work. I agree with many, but let me comment on just one: collaboration with other institutions. As Ngaire's pointed out, the world is complex. Solutions to global problems are going to require institutions and private sector organizations to increasingly work together. How to evaluate this is a bigger question. In setting up IEO, we looked at other evaluation offices. Now that was 20 years ago, and no doubt things have changed. But there were two critical factors that drove our decision-making at that time. First, we concluded that the mistake of many evaluation offices was to be too involved with management. They were more a review function, such as that which SBR was performing, rather than a truly independent evaluation function. Hence, we made IEO truly independent. The director was accountable for making decisions, but had to be very transparent about it and was not involved in the follow-up. It was clear that was the board and management's function. Secondly, in looking at the other evaluation offices, we saw that they were largely staffed by insiders who, unfortunately, sometimes it was a way to shift non-performers out of a line function. And sometimes it was a way for insiders to sort of get back because they disagreed with the way certain policies were being conducted. Hence, we required the majority of IEO staff to come from outside of the IMF to maintain a balance and to ensure that the office wasn't being driven by future career prospects or by fixed views. And one can debate to what extent that's been successful, but it was an important consideration. I guess so I had to add a third. It was there was too much in these other organizations, emphasis on evaluative checklist frameworks rather than effectiveness, as John Hicklin reminded us yesterday. And so the experience in other offices shaped IEO's design. And when we tried during my time to conduct cooperative evaluations, frankly, we found other organizations were pulling their shots Indeed, they asked, well, we can't say this. We can't criticize an organization like this. Obviously, one has to be careful in one's choice of words, but I think IEO is being very successful in doing that. But that was a real problem in working with other organizations. And so we concluded at that time that collaborative evaluations were unlikely to be a fruitful area for activity. And so I guess the question in my mind is, have times changed sufficiently, or will IEO, because I agree very much that this is a critical issue, but will IEO have to find other ways to go about trying to address these issues? And so let me stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Tom. Very interesting comments. Over to you, Bessma.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I really enjoyed Ngaire's presentation. It was a fantastic overview of the key issues. And Tom, it was a pleasure to hear you. And I remember my first interaction with the IEO was, I think, your first or second year in the office, and came to visit you there. So it's a lovely seeing things come around full circle. Let me just say, I think that, you know, the geopolitical environment that we live in is really quite troubling. And, you know, of course, I think the IEO serves a really important checks and balances on a number of things happening in the fund. And if we think of the IMF as governed by the executive directors and management, you know, one of the things that I think we often forget is staff. And a lot of my work is really focused on staff and how important they are to the essence of thinking of the IMF. But like all organizations and like all staff, they need to evolve. They need to constantly be challenged. You know, norms are changing every day. The fact that we're focusing on the environment in such an important way is certainly not enough. You know, was something that needed to be incorporated in staff thinking. Same with gender. Really happy to see some real strong work happening inside the fund right now today, thinking about gender. So, you know, the IEO to me has always played this really important role to ensure that the IMF staff are indeed, you know, adopting a learning culture, that there is room for cultural change. So, you know, it is very much in line with ensuring that this organization, I think, functions as designed. And to me, you know, the IMF is always meant to be a technographic organization. I mean, you can't help but avoid it in the way it reports, the way it documents papers. I mean, I think, you know, there's a great book by ethnographer talking about the IMF. It's one of my favorites, really, because it really looks at the paper trail. And I think anybody who's worked with the organization knows the way things kind of move is pretty interesting. And I remember, I'm old enough to remember when it was called, the SDR was called the PDR. And I hate to say it, someone once told me it was propaganda, dogma, and oh gosh, I'm forgetting what the R was for, but there was an internal kind of joke about what the PDR stood for. But it was just this essence of constantly checking that things are as, you know, as devised in terms of, you know, following certain steps and procedures. And so I think this technocratic orientation of the IMF is not going to go away. It's probably, I think, embedded in sort of the way economists also think. So by virtue of the kinds of people one hires, you know, if we start moving into hiring more lawyers, we're going to have lots of people raising questions because lawyers are philosophical, you know, so you really one can't be surprised that the IMF is a very much a technocratic organization. But, you know, with technocracy, with all sorts of formats where there's over-reliance on technical aspects, you know, there are flaws. And that's where I think the IEO really does so remarkably well in really challenging the staff constantly to do better. Think about these normative issues before us. And through these evaluations, it's an important checks and balances on the IMF. So I think we need to obviously invest in the IEO because it provides, I think, that accountability. We need more transparency. I mean, the IMF from where it was 20 some years ago to where it is today is like night and day. Anybody knows that. I think when I first encountered the IMF, being a grad student in the basement of the archives in '98, or in the library, you know, speaking to IMF staff was forbidden technically. I remember a few telling me, we're not allowed to talk to you. And things have certainly changed. So it is very much, I think, improved that way. But you know, the role of the IEO in ensuring that, you know, the best practices of transparency and accountability, which again are normative changes that are happening in the world today. We are constantly being asked to think about how do we how do we make government more accountable, more democratic? How do we make citizens being able to engage more? So this is, again, just yet another normative shift. And in fact, I would say the IEO was early compared to some of what we're seeing in even democratic countries today with the concepts and ideas of transparency. Lastly, I just want to point out that going back to the geopolitical, and I think, Ngaire put it in such perfect terms, but this lack of, or this kind of diminishing level of trust, it's globalized now. And I'm not going to go so far as talk about deglobalization and decoupling, because I know that's a really hot topic today. But, when we look at supply chains, I can't help, I'm fixated by it. The trends of where this is going politically is not good. I mean, in Canada here, we look at what's happening in the United States as protectionism light. It is increasingly a more introverted world. And, you can go from country to country, and it really is a different world today. So while the IEO and the IMF are becoming, I would say, more open and transparent and more cooperative, the challenge we have is that the world is going the other way. We are seeing, again, more of that introverted politics, more pessimism. Inequality certainly doesn't help that, and I think creates very healthy conversations about how can we bring back questions about prosperity and an adequate standard of living. But I think we are in a very turbulent world ahead of us. The great power of politics is a big part of this. The China-American competition cannot be ignored, but the rise of populist nationalists throughout the world in leading democracies like India, seeing this happening in Brazil today, in Turkey. I mean, one can go down the list. It is a really long list. And certainly inside Europe itself, from Poland to Hungary and others. So I think the IEO needs to prepare itself for a more contested executive board. That means there's going to be more pressure on, I think, management and staff. And this is where I think the IEO is going to really have to double down and face a lot of hard choices when they're approached by this kind of geopolitical rivalry that's going to certainly, if not already, and I'm not privy to knowing, but certainly not already exhibit itself in the executive board. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bessma. I hope we can come back to some of your points in the second round. But let me turn the floor over now to Siddharth.
Thank you, Prakash. It's an honor to be here today. On the topic of the session, does evaluation strengthen institutions? My answer is a resounding yes, both from my time in the IMF and later. There's no doubt in my mind that the work of the IEO is the absolute key anchor for the work of the institution. And in my comments today, I will bring together two pieces of work to try and put some structure around several of the questions that were asked yesterday and today. And the two pieces of work are the work of Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman on biases and that of the Basel Committee on controlling risk. So the why of the IEO, path-breaking work by Kahneman focused on deriving integrated insights from psychological research into economic science, especially concerning human judgment and decision-making under uncertainty. It pointed to three kinds of bias: confirmation bias, the tendency to prioritize evidence confirming what we already think or suspect, to view facts and ideas we encounter as further confirmation, and to discount and to ignore any piece of evidence that supports an alternative view. A narrative bias, the tendency to explain unpredicted events with stories that are simple and coherent, and a loss aversion bias, the tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquire equivalent gains. It's clear from this work that knowledge management and the use of accumulated knowledge, which is an instrumental tool for realizing the mandate of the IMF, is part of the DNA of the IMF, is prone to confirmation and narrative bias. And Kahneman also tells us that the approach and the methodology needs to be under review constantly. So the why of the IEO is very clear. It's clear from decades of work that has gone into empirical work under uncertainty. The how of the IEO, I will move to another line of thought, which goes under the heading of 3 lines of defense, that offers some insight into how this work should be undertaken. For colleagues who are not familiar with this, the 3 line of defense is a governance framework developed in the financial industry, widely adopted across the industry after the global financial crisis, and one of the principles of the Basel Committee. Its features are, as you would imagine, 1, those who create, encounter, and benefit from taking risks are primarily responsible to managing those risks. This is the so-called first line of defense. In the IMF, this would mean country teams engaged in surveillance or program discussions. Second is a control function that's required to ensure that the risks are identified, controlled, and managed within appropriate boundaries. In the IMF, this would be the review function within the institution, which is the second line of defense. There's a third line of defense to ensure that there's an independent assurance that the risk taker and the risk controller are interacting in the appropriate manner. This is the internal or external audit functions or independent evaluations. In my view, there's a fourth line of defense in international organizations, namely to ensure that the system, not one particular institution within the system, but the entire system is functioning adequately. The IEO, as it's defined, is operating somewhere between the third and the fourth line of defense in the IMF. A few lessons from this that emerge right away are that evaluation needs to be evidence-based rather than reporting anecdotes, because that's what helps credibility. For example, just to push it a little bit further, the terms groupthink or intellectual capture need to be defined in terms of confirmation bias, narrative bias, or loss aversion bias that has been studied extensively in the literature. As to what to evaluate and who decides, it's very clear from this literature that IEO should have operational independence within the guardrails and free to choose what topic it wants to look at. There was a long debate on whether current programs should be looked at or not. This framework would say current programs are first line of defense. They are not between the third or the fourth line of defense. In the same way, in the design phase of institutional involvement, it belongs to the first or the second line of defense. On the governance of the fund that was raised, I think thematic issues concerning quota voice are squarely within the remit of the IEO. The board, board discussions at the board, or the quality of discussions at the board, is another intrinsic part of the governance of the institution, and that is squarely the remit of the IEO. On collaboration with other institutions, it's a key, and it is here where I think the IEO needs to stretch a little bit. That what is clear is, from what Ngaire said, the discussion yesterday, that we are in an era where every future crisis will be inadequate attention to global public goods. So whether it is cyber, pandemics, climate, data, financial flows, and when this happens, the first and the second line of defense collapse. A country goes in crisis, a region goes in crisis, and several decades of work is lost. And here, frankly, I think every 3 to 5 years, the IEO needs to collaborate with other IEOs to see whether the system is fully accounted for, not one institution, not one team, but whether there's a gap in the system or not. And finally, I think in the paper you wrote, Prakash, there was an issue whether we need to revisit the benefits of industrial policy. Modern management today is platform management in the digitalized economy, where the entire management is taking place through public-private partnerships. The public sector provides the regulatory framework, and the private sector manages the consumer interface and innovation. Just to remind you, this is not picking a winner. After all, both the GPS and the internet their birth happened in the public sector. So the role of public policy is, in fact, to provide the architecture or the underpinnings on which industrial policy can take place. If the public sector doesn't do it, the private sector will, and it will lead to financial crisis. Maybe I stop here and then I'll come in later on other points. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Siddharth. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Jim, do you want to, Jim Boughton, do you want to come in and ask your question, please?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was very impressed by Ngaire's talk, as would be expected, and I particularly note that she has laid out a very broad agenda for the IMF and therefore for the IEO, in saying we have these crises, we have a medical pandemic, we have climate change, we have growing inequality. And the IMF has a responsibility to deal with all that, and I think that's right. But you know, I mean, I've been involved with the IMF for 40 years now, and I've heard a lot of the criticisms, and one very persistent criticism for at least the last 30 years has been that the IMF engages in mission creep. Whatever comes up as a crisis, the IMF feels a need to get involved with it. And there's the way I see it is there's a trade-off between maintaining relevance and maintaining adherence to your core mandate. And it seems to me that the IEO, in addition to having a mandate to monitor how well the IMF is handling these various additional challenges, also should have a responsibility to monitor whether the IMF is exceeding what is rational or optimal for responding to crises. The IMF cannot be everything to every crisis, and I think everybody would agree with that. But so I think there's just a missing piece in what Ngaire was explaining as to what the responsibility of the IEO should be when questions come up as to whether it is going too far in responding to new crises as they came up. So if maybe Ngaire or the panelists could give us their reactions to that, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay, well, why don't we start with you, Ngaire, and then see if the others would like to speak to this point as well. Please go ahead.
Yes, so I think the first question to ask, Jim, and thank you for your question and comments. I think the first question to ask about an expansion of the IMF's mandate, the first thing that the IEO can and should ask about it is at whose behest? Is this new initiative or this new extension of mandate just the management idea, or is it fully supported by all the members of the institution? Is it being pushed by one of the powerful members? In other words, to me, the first recourse is for the IEO to do the multilateral check. The second is, to me, the parameter, as you describe it, is about whether the issue has deep fiscal and monetary consequences. And on climate and COVID, both policies have deep fiscal and monetary consequences. And furthermore, countries' fiscal and monetary policies and the unconventional monetary policies of the last decade have deepened inequalities, have had deep distributional consequences. So how the fund thinks about that and advises countries about that, actually, I think, is squarely within the fund's current mandate. I don't think it is an extension. I certainly don't think the IEO should be a keeper of the faith, because a fund that keeps the faith is a fund that consigns itself, I think, to history. Can I just add one more comment, Prakash? I think
yes, please.
In Siddharth's very elegant comment, Siddharth, I'm intrigued by what you say about the IEO's role is to deal with the three biases that Danny Kahneman tells us so much about. Are we saying here that the IMF only makes, the only, as it were, mistakes the IMF makes are these kinds of biases? Because my point is, no, actually, the bigger problem is political. It's not about, do, highly trained economists, get into a loss aversion bias in their programs. It's much more, what is the political parameter, which could well be exacerbating those biases? And I would say it has exacerbated those biases, but I think it comes back to the political, which is to say, where is it that we're seeing the multilateralism of the institution eroded because one of its powerful members is railroading something through?
Siddharth, did you want to respond to that, please?
Yeah, so both to Jim and Ngaire's points, I think when it comes to global public goods, and I would list four of them right away, or five: climate, pandemic, cyber, data, financial flows. When the EPG report was done in 2017, pandemics was taken as an example and sort of worked out as one global public good that was completely underfunded. Not because we knew that a pandemic was around the corner, but every global public good has lacked sufficient investment. It's not the IMF's job to plug the lack of investment, but it's definitely IMF's job to point out that there's a hole in the system. It is definitely IEO's job to point out that there's a hole in the system, because when a crisis of a global public good happens, decades of work is compromised. What we do at the country level, what we do at the multilateral level, it's tossed out of the window for several decades. And if we can't control these large crises, that we will take a step back. And you had a vivid description of it in terms of what COVID-19 has done, both between countries and within countries. I think where the biases come in is in bilateral work, and where the inability to separate out change. And I thought in my own time in the IMF, a lot of work that IEO did on the mandate of the institution was something that we used to try and move the mandate in a different direction. The work on spillovers, the work on capital flows, the new surveillance decision, a lot of them had their roots in the work IEO had done. So where evidence-based work was done, I think it succeeded. Where it relied on anecdotes, it got a very negative reaction. And so there I would urge the IEO to move more and more in the direction. Just finally, I think Jim, there's going to be a constant struggle in staying within the mandate but having the ability to point out what is lacking within the system. And the last three crises have come straight out of that. It's not been individual policies here and there, it's been systemic.
Thanks very much, Siddharth. I know we have Sunil Sharma who wants to ask a question. I'll come to you next, Karan. Sunil?
Thanks very much for a really scintillating discussion. I think this is, in some sense, addresses a lot of the points that were raised. I mean, I've spent 25 years. I spent 25 years at the IMF, and when I started in 1992, there was this sense. There was this, I would say, a intellectual consensus among the larger shareholders, and that we should be thinking of the economic subsystem as separated from the political or other aspects of the global system. And what I hear Ngaire saying and all others saying is that we really can't think about these complexities as separate anymore. And my own sense is that we are rethinking many of our intellectual frameworks on how to view the world. And there we are really thinking in terms of political economy frameworks. Now, this is going to make the job of the IMF, which was conceived to be technocratic, much more difficult and much more contentious. And given that this complex system that we've constructed is facing systemic challenges. Now, for systemic challenges, it's very difficult as to provide ex-ante evidence, right? There may be tinder, there could be a variety of triggers. We don't know how they could play out. How do we create a governance system where we can, without sufficient evidence that this is going to lead us over a precipice of some kind, actually take actions when we have the kind of geostrategic rivalry and uncertainties that we're now faced? How do we design these institutions to be able to speak to something that could happen, which could be very dangerous, which could be really going over a precipice? Climate is an example where we have to take actions now without the fires really being visible. How do we govern a system like that? That's my question.
Thanks very much, Sunil. While the panel is pondering, let me also ask Karan's question on his behalf in the interest of time, Karan. I guess this is mainly for Ngaire, but actually everyone could comment on it. And Ngaire, I guess since you mentioned you were on the advisory panel for the AIIB, Karan wants to know how you see the role of China in the AIIB in comparison to the role the US plays in the IMF. So I guess how do dominant shareholders behave in other institutions, particularly the AIIB? And I guess Karan is wondering whether we are going to see some specialization in institutions where they are catering to a narrow set of functions, like perhaps the AIIB does, or to narrow geographical regions. So let me turn to you, Ngaire, and then also go around the table. Could I add one question, perhaps for Bessma and Siddharth? And I think both Ngaire and Bessma described a kind of a geopolitical situation that's quite difficult and tense. Siddharth, I was wondering, as someone sitting in Asia, how do you see this geopolitical? How do you see the geopolitical situation? I realize in an official capacity you may be constrained, but I wonder if you have any views sitting in Asia, how you see the rivalry. Thanks. Let me turn it to Ngaire, and then perhaps we go around all the panelists, including Tom, for a final set of comments. Ngaire, let's start with you.
Yeah, well, I think the questions actually come together. So, if I start with Karan's question about the AIIB, so China has 40% of the votes. It's now got over 100 members, and it's adopted many of the multilateral conventions of the IMF and World Bank, but it has not adopted a resident board. It has a non-resident board. And I think it has many of the same issues around asymmetric information and inexperience across its board as the IMF and World Bank do. And, you know, I've never been quite convinced that the distribution of several 100,000 pages of materials to resident boards each year has resulted in proactive, you know, accurate institution strengthening oversight by boards in the fund and bank. So I think all three institutions could do with some renovating in how their boards actually work and with what disciplines. But I think what we can learn from the AIIB is just to remember that the challenge for multilaterals is always the same one. It's first, how do you persuade the most powerful states to engage? And that almost always means you give them some special rights. And second, how do you ensure the consent of the rest? And that means you need protections of the rights of the rest in the institution. And that's fundamental to each one of these institutions. It's just that politically, people look at other countries' institutions and say, well, that's unfair, they've got a special role, forgetting, of course, that they themselves have a special role. So I think it's quite important to understand this trade-off between ensuring that you've got the participation of the powerful and the consent of the rest. And it's on that knife's edge that multilateralism is built. So Sunil asks, how then do we govern in the great rivalry? Well, I think the founders of the Fund and Bank and the United Nations in San Francisco in 45 thought really hard about this, and they had the brutalizing experience of the 20s and 30s and the failures of cooperation, which Harold, who was here yesterday, has written so brilliantly about. They had all that as to guide them in thinking through how to navigate this tension between putting the powerful at the middle but having the consent of the rest. And I think they came up with a reasonably good system, but we have to keep working the system. Now, I'm an optimist. Some of you know me well enough to know that I'm always optimistic, but I'm an optimist because we see the G20, even at the height of tension between China and the United States, we see a G20 that is still managing to agree, whether it's on an SDR, you know, new allocation, or whether it's on the beginnings of a debt suspension initiative, or whether it's on you know, a commitment to taking forward a climate framework. We're still seeing that agreement. Why? Because these really are cooperative outcomes without which the great powers, you know, cannot take forward their own agendas. So I think we have the system. We've got to keep renovating it, and we've got to stop it becoming, we've got to stop the international institutions becoming the pawns of either of the great powers. And that means not thinking, in my view, there is a tendency to think about the IMF as either technocratic or not technocratic. And I think that's a mistake, because the question in the midst of the geostrategic rivalry is to think about which powerful states have the most influence, which powerful states are seen to have the most influence, and how do you assure the rest? What are the systems of governance you put in place to assure the rest? I think, was there a final question? No,
I think that you did tackle all the questions. Thanks very much, Ngaire. We only have a minute left. I think we can borrow 2 or 3 minutes from the next session. But let me go around the table now and see if Tom, and then Bessma, and finally Siddharth have any closing remarks. Tom, let's start with you.
Okay, maybe just one comment, and that's on the asymmetric power relationship between the IMF and the other organizations, which I think is something that needs careful thought. I mean, I made some comments about IEO and its structure, at least in the origins, vis-a-vis other evaluation offices, but you can broaden that out to the institutions. I mean, the IMF is a intellectually remarkably strong, disciplined organization, and it can be intimidating to other organizations. And so how one can work in that sort of environment is something that requires a lot of very, very careful thought. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Tom. Bessma?
Yeah, I'll just quickly add that I think, you know, one of the challenges, of course, is, I mean, think about the executive board and how power is really distributed there is at the end of the day, it's based on quotas and shares. And we've seen just how protracted that can be to just get change on such a simple thing. I mean, you would look at the fact that, power, economic, I should say, weight has naturally shifted to emerging market economies. You would think that European powers would just recognize the reality and shift some of that quota and shares to the emerging market economies, and similarly the Americans, which I don't think have been nearly as problematic in recognizing that they need to give up some power, and they have. But of course, their system of just the entire congressional system has made this so fraught and difficult to get through. So I mean, I think it's important for the IMF to be nimble when it comes to their power sharing within, but the challenge is the structure doesn't make it such because of the unanimity, or at least the consensus that's required and when trying to make these changes. So, and back to one last point is that, I think as we see more of these emerging market economies become more autocratic and increasingly not follow the rules of the institution, I mean, the core rules of the institutions, like an open trade system, etc., as they become more protectionist and more introverted and start to apply policies that don't really go in line with what the IMF was meant to foster, will the European powers be more reluctant to perhaps transfer power to the emerging market economies? I mean, I see that kind of showdown coming. So these are the things that I think need to be thought about.
Thanks very much. Siddharth, the last word to you.
Yes, so just from my side, to answer the question, you do see a massive political divide, if that's the word to use. But on the economic side, I don't see it. I don't see it in trade. I don't see it in FDI. I don't see it in the role of the dollar. In fact, I would go as far as saying that these two countries are more joined together, and both of them will lose immensely from any crisis in the global public goods. And that's where they can cooperate.
Okay, that seems like a hopeful note on which to end the session. Thank you all for your participation, particularly, of course, to Ngaire for delivering a keynote address that, as Jim Bouton said, to no one's surprise lived up to its billing. So thanks very much, Ngaire, for joining us for our 20th birthday.